Special counsel Robert Mueller has dominated dozens of news cycles with his investigation into alleged Russian meddling in U.S. politics. But that's not the only DOJ investigation going on. Inspector General Michael Horowitz has spent a year investigating how Jim Comey and the FBI handled their investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server. Horowitz is the one who found Peter Strzok's text messages to his paramour bashing Donald Trump. Chris Swecker is a former assistant director at the FBI. He says Jim Comey's conduct last year has become a trap for Mueller's own investigation. Chris, I guess to use the president's words, whether or not the FBI is tainted, Mueller's investigation has been tainted by the revelations about these never-Trumpers in the previous investigation.
Well, Director Mueller is living with some of the things, some of the decisions and bad judgment of former Director Comey, who was in the position for 4 years before Director Mueller was appointed special counsel. And what's happened with Agent Strzok and his paramour is not helpful to the investigation, wherever his investigation is going. With 38 years of experience in this business around criminal investigations, I can tell you a good defense attorney can make something out of this alleged bias.
Yeah, that's critical if any of this stuff ever winds up before a jury. You lay the blame on Comey. His behavior since being removed from the Bureau, and indeed during the last couple of years before that, seems like a man temperamentally unsuited for the job he held. Is that a fair estimation?
Well, frankly, I was surprised at his judgment and his behavior. He had a good reputation. I think the agents liked him. He's very personable, and I dealt with him in my capacity as head of the FBI's criminal division. But the judgment that he displayed and the rules that he broke when he made a prosecutive decision as the FBI director and then announced it in great detail to the American public, instead of handing that investigation off to Loretta Lynch, who, if he thought was conflicted, could have recused herself and passed it down one notch, was just monumental bad judgment. I think a series of cascading events have that is what has drawn the FBI into politics.
Let me ask you about that, because if a crime winds up in the county courthouse, a policeman investigates it and the county attorney decides whether to prosecute it. In this case, the policeman and the county attorney were the same person, Jim Comey. Is that unusual in the Bureau's history?
Very unusual. If you look at the Justice Department procedures and the FBI's procedures and the Code of Federal Regulations, there is a separation between investigations and prosecution. The FBI will predicate an investigation with facts. They'll open it up, they'll conduct the investigation, they'll consult with the U.S. Attorney, but the final prosecutive decisions are always made by either the U.S. Attorney or someone within the main Justice Department. That's just the way it works.
Let me ask you this, because as I understand it, there's about 35,000 employees of the FBI, yet the same handful of people investigating one presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, then seemed to transfer seamlessly to investigate the other presidential candidate, Donald Trump. Do you think that's best practice, as it were?
No, I don't. Obviously, former Director Comey thought that was his A-team, so he had them transition very quickly to the Russian investigation after what I thought was a very half-hearted non-investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails. So that investigation runs out supposedly, and then it seems like a good percentage of that team was assigned to the Russian investigation with all the baggage that they brought with them.
Yeah, you'd almost think it was like one reputation investigation. Get Hillary off the hook, and if that doesn't work, get Trump onto it. Chris, thanks very much. Interesting to hear from a former #3 G-man during these recent years. The United Nations got a fat lump of coal in its Christmas stocking this year, courtesy of the Trump administration. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley has announced a $285 million cut cut to the UN's budget for 2018. The US pays 22% of the UN's overall operating costs. Dr. Alan Mendoza is Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, a British think tank. Dr. Mendoza, how are these supposed cuts to America's UN largesse playing in London and elsewhere in Europe?
Well, not well. I think they've played about as well as the American decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. This is not the most popular policy in Europe, but I've got to be honest, I think the Americans have done the right thing here. You're looking after your own financial responsibilities, and you're making it clear that it won't be business as usual at the UN, and things have to change.
Well, to go back to that Jerusalem vote that you just mentioned, isn't that actually part of the problem with the UN, that it's a very lavish body for striking attitudes? And that doesn't matter whether it's the Organization for Islamic Cooperation or the European Union. They all swan into the General Assembly and strike an attitude on Israel and then stick US taxpayers with the tab for it. I mean, is there any purpose to a body such as that?
Well, I think the General Assembly is just a waste of space. I mean, if you look at what you see there, you see democracies completely outnumbered by non-democracies, which wasn't, I think, the goal of the UN when it was set up. And as you say, you have every hobby horse being flogged, and the results are that frequently the democracies don't get their way in terms of what you might think would be sensible international policy, and you get crazy things passed through. Now, fortunately, of course, it has no sort of standing value. But then you've got a question, as you suggest, what's the point of an organisation, or at least a body, that has no ability to influence things and which gets hijacked in this way?
Meanwhile, back in the real world, the Islamic State has lost 98% of its territory. And yet that's barely made the papers because nobody wants to give Donald Trump the credit for it.
Well, I think this is the big story of 2017. It's been the defeat of the so-called everlasting caliphate. And indeed, Donald Trump and, of course, the American military must take a lot of responsibility and praise for this. But you're right, it doesn't come across in terms of public understanding, or certainly political elite understanding. But I think we will feel the impact of this going forwards in reduced terrorist attacks, of course, a reduced threat going forwards from radical Islam and other such matters. So, yes, I think the world does owe a great debt to Donald Trump, and indeed to all those who have prosecuted this war to its ultimate end point.
What's your solution to the UN? Because it's basically the World War II victory parade. It's America, Britain, France, Russia, plus China. And if you want to reform anything, various of those parties object. Is it just something that should be left to die, every 200 million by 200 million cut, or can it be reformed?
Well, I think you've hit upon something there, which is that the way to reform it is not to try and get consensus, because it's impossible. Which power, say, of those five alone will give up their veto power and look at that? Which group will want to sort of, succumb to less influence? It can't work that way. But I think the way's been shown, in a sense, by this budget cut. You've got the ability now to reform the step and say, we don't think this works. We're not funding it anymore. And if you don't fund it, then it won't go forwards in that way anymore. So the power is there. Do we have the confidence to use it?
That's always the question. They like their money. Dr. Mendoza, those UN diplomats. California Governor Jerry Brown has good news for the immigrants of his state. You can commit a felony, and he'll still try to keep you from being deported. We'll debate that story next on Tucker Carlson Tonight.